Our first story deals with a subculture of heavy metal music that some feel is sending a dangerous message to your kids.
The forces of evil on the dark side of devil rock.
And I want to talk tonight about the devil and demons and witches and wizards.
And we just mix it up with hardcore and aggression and come out with something we think's an original sound.
Loud, fast, heavy, you know.
Well, what do you got?
What do you got?
And welcome back to another episode of the Dillbozer's Den. Joined with you, as always, is the Dillbozer. Oh, wait a minute. There's three of us here today. Looks like it's the Riff Worship Podcast, where we discuss everything that is the who, what, when, where, why, how of riffs. Why do we love them? Why do we talk about them? Why do we worship them? I'm joined again by Sugar Grove's own Fancy Pants, Austin Paulson. How are you doing today, bud? Justin Swindle, Louisville, holding it down. You just got back from flying across the globe to go to sweet, luxurious fucking Florida to check out where you're going to retire to in the next couple of years. How you doing?
We gave you too much power immediately, right off the rip.
Dylan, this is Dylan's side gig. This is like coming down from his ivory throne.
What Thou album are we talking about today?
No one's told me how they're doing. Not a damn soul. So I guess that's how this one's going, right? Everyone's just kind of everyone's real ready for this because we're gearing up for at least the 7th Thou episode in our series of 10. So this is their rendition of the Banana Split soundtrack, right?
Right, Record Store Day
exclusive on gold and piss yellow splatter vinyl.
Everybody's gonna be, wait, what? There's no Thou part 6, 10.
So today we're talking about an album that means so much to me. That was a huge record for my adolescence and who I am now and why I do what I do and the type of music I listen to. We're talking about another record from the big old year of 2004, 20 years ago. I'm fucking old. And this album is getting there. Talking about Lamb of God's Ashes of the Wake, their major label debut album.
An album that's just as relevant now as it was in 2004 lyrically.
You aren't fucking kidding.
No.
That all.
I thought this was just about, y'all read the lyrics? What was it about? I'm so confused. The year was 2004 and not too many. You know what's crazy about this record is that I feel like, and I could be wrong, but you got Lamb of God, the Chicks, Lamb of God and the Chicks.
Oh my God. Just laying it to Bush.
Outwardly against the, political landscape at the time. And even in interviews, like really not holding back whatsoever, which got to give it to them for sure. I mean, I don't know if they got as much flack as the Chicks got during this time. Probably not.
No,
I wonder why.
Yeah, no kidding.
I went to the Country Music Hall of Fame one time and literally some sick bastard had to put this in motion because we know they're all very intelligent people, probably in that organization. They put the Dixie Chicks stuff right next to the Toby Keith stuff. Like right next. Now, and my dad was there. This is years ago. And he was just like fucking monsters, like out loud, just like, it was just old man screams at cloud situation. But let's get back to this record. I know how familiar I am with this record. I know how much of a big deal this was to me, still is, like, but I don't think you guys are as familiar with this record as I was.
Nope. Not even a little bit.
What'd you think?
It was hard to miss like the lead track from this record. The very first, you could not escape Laid to Rest. It was everywhere. I don't know if I heard it in video games or if maybe I heard it in Metal Headbanger's Journey for the first time, because it's like the opening track of that documentary. But yeah, I didn't listen to this like when it came out. I didn't listen to any of those bands really as I like got into high school and all that. So I would say that the biggest takeaway from this record for me is that it is a 101 class in the right hand for sure. They definitely sat with like every song and every riff, like kind of that quote, that Kirk quote of like, building off of one riff. It's clear that they just played one riff like over and over again, and then like just kind of built around that. Yeah, so lots of hooks, lots of Bay Area thrash influence on this for sure. You even have someone from the Bay Area thrash scene on the record. But yeah, so I would say that newfound appreciation, to make a long story short, as someone who did not grow up listening to this band at all.
And you've seen them twice. I
have seen them at least once.
You've seen them twice, both times with me.
When was the other time?
Lamb of God, Death Heaven, Power Trip, Anthrax, Slayer, Lamb of God, Testament, Behemoth.
Were they on that show?
They sure were. Yep.
I guess that, yeah.
They were, I believe they were actually direct support. So yeah, they were on that one for sure. It
was a long day. It was a hot day.
That was a very long day.
It was in Cincinnati. I don't a place I
every
don't,
day.
I don't wish to time runs differently in Cincinnati.
That's right. Every day is a long fucking day in Cincinnati.
Chili Vision.
Yep, yes. Yep, that's where it came from.
If you wanna spend a long time with one person, just spend a single day in Cincinnati and it'll be like time stood still.
It's the hyperbolic time change.
How many smoke stops did we have to make?
A lot. It's so many. I feel like maybe somebody who knows a smoker or was a smoker, or if that person is listening to this, like you enter through a door or exit through a door, there's already like a Marlboro Light like in hand, ready to go. Oh, he smoked American Spirits, I think. But
yeah.
So which it took forever anyway. Like it's like now we're sitting there for an hour waiting for that thing to go out.
There were points, and it was going to and from where Austin and I would be the two in the car, and we'd be waiting on the other guys to come back. And I remember him going, "God damn, he's lighting another one. He just lit one before he went in." It's like,
it's not a long drive, and we made that drive like
it's
hours longer
drive.
than it's supposed to be. I had a great time.
I did too.
Yeah, I didn't remember that they were on that show. So
on
my face.
I bet that person that smoked had a great time too.
I think they did. Yeah.
They definitely did.
We shared a bed, and we also ate like a fuck ton of White Castle after that.
Oh my God.
The smells coming from that motel room. My God. Yeah. The drive-through was like a mile long, just of like a bunch of long-haired, like tattooed, sunburnt people looking to get, a couple
whatever food was
burgers,
available.
Chicken
rings. It was
rings.
the only thing open, and it was right next to the hotel.
It was
Well, Columbus is the home of White Castle, so y'all were y'all were so close.
Oh man, I can't believe that bastard floated over on a boat just to make that shit happen. So Swindle, what'd you think of the album?
A lot of fucking open notes.
Yes.
A lot. So many open note riffs. But it was fun. It was a good time.
That low E string didn't know what hit it.
Hey man. Hey man. Hey guys, it's a metal record. What do you expect? You expect more than just an open note on there? Come on. That's the fundamental. That's the fundamental sound of a metal record.
It was very consistent, like all the way through for the most part. Like there's not too many like deviations entirely in tempo.
It's might be one of the better sequenced records from that time period too. It doesn't feel like it lags. I will say that the A side is really front heavy. The A side has probably some of the better tracks on the album, or most known, I should say. The B side has really good tracks, but they haven't been given the attention throughout the years as the A side, which I believe they still play every single song from the A side live. Swindle, you brought up the lyrical content of this album. You're a big lyrics guy. Maybe Austin and I aren't so much. I know what this album's about. I got to kind of live it in the moment when it was happening. What did you pull away from this?
I didn't read any of the lyrics, but I think the first time through I heard like the talk down in Ashes of the Wake, and I was like, oh, like
yeah,
the whole album is just an anti-war record about the war in Afghanistan, and that talk down in particular, the title track, the next to last track, it's mostly an instrumental, but there's a talk down at the beginning and the end, and the guy basically says like, this war is different from all the other wars because we just kill civilians, and it felt like
his name's slipping me, but we've got it in our notes here. But I found the actual video of that interview that they sampled from that, and it's pretty fucking chilling because like there's no sound in the background, there's no post editing to the video. It's just him talking about a book he wrote. And I thought it was just something they might have pulled from who knows what. I didn't realize it was actual documented footage that he was, speaking on. Yeah, even back then, let's see. So this definitely is 2004, but this was during the Bush and Cheney administration, which seems to have continued on for the last 20 years. And this would have been prior to the election of Bush-Kerry. I think that was the election that was taking place during this time period. And I remember seeing some of the first shots of this band, and Randy has a black shirt on, and it's on Ozfest, and it's just George Bush with a big red circle with a line through it. He wore that every single night on Ozfest. That shirt could stand up on its own by the end of that. But he made no bones about it. There's some interviews where I think he outright calls out the president. He calls him a bitch boy in a couple of them, kind of like Walton Goggins in Vice Principals. Bitch boy. Just lays into him. And this record does not let up. The album before it, As the Palaces Burned, had a political leaning as well, but maybe not as direct as this one. But yeah, I'm really happy to be digging into these albums that were huge records for me at the forefront of me getting into heavy music. This was probably behind Slipknot's Subliminal Verses. This is probably number 2. This is the second record out of that kind of initial 4 or 5 that really did it for me. So like I may not have listened to this record in the last 4 or 5 years, but I put it on. It's like, oh yeah, I can remember every drum hit, every single thing that's going on. And there's a lot going on in this record. Different things that I haven't listened to or heard in quite some time, and not realizing it was there, or it's a different version of the album now, so maybe it's a little lower in the mix or anything like that. So Lamb of God originally formed as a band in 1994 in Richmond, Virginia, called Burn the Priest. Having a band name like that can only mean one or two things. It either means you're a religious band, and it's just like, you have a thing, or, you go the opposite end and you don't really dig the way things are being done in the South, I would presume. Richmond, Virginia is kind of an art town. You have metal legends from there, Municipal Waste. You have Guar being one of the really big ones. A slew of other bands coming from that area. But these guys kind of grew up all out in the sticks. I believe Randy was definitely a punk rock guy, punk rock kid. Kind of was homeless for a certain period of time of his life. Would travel around on trains and hop on trains and different things. And somehow ended up joining a band with one Dwayne. I believe he was going by Dwayne Morton at that point, but Mark Dwayne Morton, Chris Adler, John Campbell. And I think Abe Spears was in the band at that time. Willie hadn't quite joined. Willie being Chris Adler, the drummer's younger brother. But the band went through a period of time where they released a couple demos, a couple EPs. They technically recorded a full length as Burn the Priest with Today Is the Day's own Steve Austin. Not the wrestler. If it was the wrestler, like imagine that room, but anyway, recorded with Steve Austin of Today Is the Day. The band decided to change its name also while Abe Spears had left the band to dig into photography and kind of go into that career arc. And then they changed their name to Lamb of God, and so the story begins. Lamb of God signs with Prosthetic Records, releases 2 albums for the label. 2000's New American Gospel with the classic black label on it, which actually does not have lyrics to it. It's kind of an obituary situation. So if you ever check that song out, there's no lyrics to it. There may be lyrics now, but there were no lyrics at that point. Again, record was produced by Steve Austin. Yet again, kind of back catalog, kind of, you know, keeping the same group of people there. That still sounds very familiar to the Burn the Priest stuff. It's very raw, very aggressive, very unrefined. There's a 3-year gap in between New American Gospel and As the Palaces Burn. And during that time frame, you completely refine your songwriting. You completely, create a craft. You've also got a form of music that's starting to kind of bubble in the underground a little bit. You've got this new wave of American heavy metal with bands such as Shadows Fall, Killswitch Engage, Bleeding Through, Darkest Hour, that ilk of bands, God forbid. They're all playing the metal and hardcore festivals during that period. So in this 3-year gap, you kind of meet your contemporaries during this time. Your music starts to become more present. You know, Headbangers Ball is back. New metal's starting to kind of die off during this period. So these underground forms of music are coming out. I believe the guys in Shadows Fall described it as all of the VFW bands were starting to get big. They're touring together. They're getting label interest, major label interest. Case in point, As the Palaces Burns from 2003. They no sooner than finished recording the album and started setting up tours, and Lamb of God started getting major label interest. And for a band that was prone to play to 20 people or 250 people in a VFW hall, getting major label interest was and is a big deal. And during this period of time, you know, records weren't necessarily selling the way they once were. This was the beginning of kind of the end of that traditional structure. Seeing a label take a chance on a band like Lamb of God that is really aggressive, hyper aggressive, and politically minded, and just kind of out of left field. It's remarkable to think that As the Palaces Burned came out, and it came out the same year as like the Deftones self-titled record. I think Korn's Take a Look in the Mirror. Saint Anger came out the year before, maybe even came out that summer. I can't remember if it came out in 03 or 02. Like those were big contemporary records coming out, and then As the Palaces Burn rolls out, and it's like, oh yeah, we're going to sign these guys to a major. They hadn't done an Ozfest, they hadn't done a major tour, or with an album like As Palaces Burns. You look at it and go, there's no way in hell this band's ever going to be signed to a major. They're going to sign to like, they might sign to a Metal Blade, they might sign to a Century Media, Nuclear Blast, but Epic Records, a subsidiary of Sony Records, come on. Like, how does that fucking happen? It did. They got attention somehow. I don't know if it was management. I don't know what it may have been, but they had 2 labels touting them the entire time. And it was Roadrunner Records, and it was Epic Records. At this point in time, Roadrunner did have Killswitch Engage, who had just released their first record a year prior. So that makes sense. Roadrunner Records signing a band like this makes complete sense. They kind of dipped their toe in the water with Killswitch Engage, started to see that they were drawing an influence, drawing all these younger people in, people that could still buy records, going to these tours, going to these different shows, selling them out. But Epic Records, at this point in time, I don't really know who Epic Records have. I would assume that they would have a lot of the new metal bands that were still popular at this point in time. But we move forward. I know I said a lot. I mean, what do you guys kind of take on, a band like this signing to a major?
I mean, I guess, clearly they saw that a trend was occurring, with all of these bands coming through. Maybe somebody working in A&R at Epic Records was like, hey, Killswitch is doing this. I don't know. Had the record, at what point during, they get signed in 2003, right?
Yes.
Okay. So had any, off the top of your head, had there been any big records from any of those bands within this like new wave had come out yet? Or, I mean, I know 2004 is obviously a very big year. I don't know if anything had come out.
The only 2 off the top of my head were Killswitch Engage's Alive or Just Breathing, Shadows Falls, The Art of Balance, but those both came out in 02. So those were starting to see that, but this was also during the period of time where Headbangers Ball had initially started coming. So you had Jamie just pushing all these. Well, that actually brings this up. Hatebreed was on a major label at this point in time.
Okay.
They were on like Warner Brothers or some shit.
I guess, yeah, somebody really just kind of taking a gamble, I guess, and just, especially since it doesn't really seem like, had they been, what, do you know why there was a gap between those two records initially, 2000, did they just go on the road like super hard, or?
I think they were going on the road. This was also during a period of time where, this style of underground music maybe wasn't as prevalent. So like tours were probably few and far between.
Sure.
I mean, Guar took him out on tour. I think Guar went on tour with him with Mushroom Head at one point. So like, it's kind of a blending of all these different bands. And I know that there was a Headbangers Ball tour around this time that had Killswitch, Shadows Fall, and Lamb of God on the same bill. And I think Unearthed was opening.
Wow.
So that could have very well had pushed it. Also, there were 3 videos associated with the As the Palaces Burn album.
Okay.
Tracks Ruin, 11th Hour, and the title track, which are all classics in their own right.
So yeah, I mean, it is pretty shocking. I mean, I don't know, like, to me, yeah, this sounds great, but to market it to like mass audiences, like, yeah, you're really kind of taking a gamble here. And, with all of these bands that we kind of mentioned in this, like, new wave of American heavy metal, I feel like it almost does it kind of like an injustice in a way. Not that it means to, but it, obviously I think it's just trying to, mark a milestone in music, or like, okay, here's a turning point, but it also kind of, groups all these bands that really don't sound anything
Right.
like each other. So yeah, it's interesting. I wonder who was the person that was like, all right, Lamb of God, that's what we're doing. That's the band we're running with here. Epic Records. The name's John Epic. Here you go. Sign the contract, Randy Blythe.
They were apparently in the courting of the labels. Roadrunner was always there, obviously. And the Roadrunner deal was apparently going to be, and this is all rumors, but it was supposed to be the biggest Roadrunner deal for any U.S. band of all time at this point in time, which is interesting to think about, because it's like, I'm sure they sold a few thousand records by this point, but it's not like this is the same band that they would be 3 years following this to sign to it. So that's really interesting to think about.
I'm sure that got around, and that is how they got signed to Epic, because they probably were like, oh, if this other label like has so much faith in them, there must be a reason why.
So they definitely used Roadrunner Records as a way to negotiate with other record labels. There were many that came to them, but the 2 big ones were Epic and Roadrunner. They met with the Epic Label Records president, Paulie Anthony, and I guess they just got on really well. They went to this really nice New York restaurant. All these fucking dudes from Virginia in this nice restaurant, New York. And she's like she's chain smoking the entire time. People are coming up to her, go, ma'am, you can't smoke in here. This is Newark. Fuck off. And just keeps going on and on. A $30,000 fine she had to pay for smoking. Probably just billed to the label as a write-off, because she's like, oh yeah, I was meeting with this band.
Wow.
Like,
yeah,
the fucking power. And apparently they got on well with her for the rest of their time period that she was around. She's since passed away, but they're like, oh yeah, she's fucking great.
Hopefully she got in a fight with Giuliani. She was like, hey, let me smoke in it. I'm smoking in the restaurant. Hey, fight. Suck my dick, Giuliani.
Hey man, that guy's selling coffee now. Be careful.
It's a big toidle in a trench coat.
That Dana Carvey on TV.
The best picture of that man is where he was sweating out all that fucking
his hair oil
just melting.
I love that shit.
God, it's like the clip from The Witches, the old, like the early 90s film The Witches, where they're all like changing out of their skin suits in the hotel lobby. It's terrifying. It's the same thing. Anyway, they met with Paulie Anthony, had a great time, really enjoyed her. They met with the A&R guy that signed Rage Against the Machine and signed Korn. He made a good impression on them, and they kind of moved forward. They just signed the dotted line. As they took it, they're like, listen, this could, we don't know how long this is going to last. This could blow up in our face. We've been handed a really big fucking microphone, so let's just use it and abuse it. And they kind of went with their punk rock ethos and went, fuck it, let's just do it. Like, let's do it. Let's give it a shot. Fuck, it's you get a chance. Very, very rarely do you get a chance to sign to a major label, especially during a time period like this. And, you know, sometimes it's a hit, sometimes it's a miss. There are so many bands that have signed to major labels and they get the big push and then nothing happens, right? You know, they get the big push, the album comes out and they go back to the indies. Perfectly fine career move. You get that one album on the major and you can always go, well, we had our one major label record, right? You know, and the fear of that is the major labels are going to start molding you, moving you. We need you to do this. We need you to do this. Apparently that didn't happen with this band. They're just like, hey, yeah, just do your thing.
You would think, you know, as a major, and I guess this is like more a, you know, testament to Epic or whoever was handling that deal where they just like kind of took a step back and let them do their thing. Cause like, yeah, this is very like vocally like anti-American, anti like military, you know, industrial military complex, you know, Bush Cheney America. And they were like, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, put it out. Like, do whatever. Like, I don't the backlash, whatever. It doesn't matter to us. Like, it's we'll back it.
Not to put this band's lyrics down, but if Epic also had Rage Against the Machine,
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
Like,
absolutely.
Yeah, this is true.
Yeah. Because like when your again, here you go. When your debut single with the label has fuck as the exclamation point in the track, come on. I mean, Laid to Rest.
Yeah. They love that. Randy loves the word fuck.
Randy loves 4-letter superlatives.
What's your favorite curse word?
During this period of time, he was a very vocal individual. He's kind of dialed it back in his years since then. He's kind of taken kind of the peaceful surfer kind of vibe at this point, but he was a rager during this point.
He has since found sobriety. I understand it, but yes.
Oh, he definitely has.
Yes.
But there were periods of time during this era that were just like, holy shit. Riding around I found a video where he's just riding around on a bike outside one of the shows with all the fans just drinking liquor with him.
Oh my God.
Just having fun. He's like, oh yeah, this guy's on our message board all the time, like drinking a 40 and talking about his t-shirt.
Well, I mean, there's the video. I don't know if
Oh,
we
the
need to bring
fight?
it up. There's the fight. Which,
Oh, yeah.
you know, again, you know, I've heard him say like people thought like, I can't believe you guys are in the same room together. He's like, yeah, man, we're so close. It was bound to happen.
We'll dig into that a little bit, but there's a great clip before the fight where they're all on the bus and they have like this pretty big tour manager at the time, like just one of those kind of, he's a hoss, right? Just really thick, kind of like Southern guy. And he's looking out, he's like, Mark, you all right with going to jail? Yep. As he's putting his Chuck Taylors on. They're in the streets of like, I think it's Ireland, maybe Scotland. And
God.
it's just, everybody has just had enough of each other and they just waylay each other out there. Randy's, what's that?
How big a boy are you? How big a boy are you?
And I had that DVD, we'll dig into it. But I watched it with the commentary one time and
Oh my
Randy
God.
pops up and goes, no matter what size band you are, no matter where you are, any tour that you're on, you'll always have a guy like that on every tour, referring to that tour manager. He's like, you will always have that guy on tour with you. But this band made no bones about it. This band was this band. They weren't changing for anybody. And we got a hell of a record out of that. And you got a record kind of built out of a short amount of time. I mean, Palaces came out in 2003. This came out in August of 2004. Palaces, I believe, was March of 2003. So you've got just a little over a year and some change prior to this record coming out. And they had pretty well tapped the vein when it came to As the Palaces Burned. They had put a lot of effort and time into the recording of that record. It was produced loosely by Devin Townsend of Strapping Young Lad and his solo projects. And he was kind of just brought in to hit the record button. He was basically an engineer in this sense. The band had a hard time kind of letting that control away because they just wanted to make sure that they had the best representation of what they wanted to sound like. And that's a really good record. It's a great record. It's had a remaster in the last couple decades. And it still sounds good. The songs are probably it's kind of a transitional period between their first record and this record. It's a little bit more in vein of that kind of new wave of American heavy metal sound. Whereas this record is honestly more of a thrash driven kind of groove metal thing. But But, you know, they tapped the vein dry. They had no tracks written over. They had nothing like carried over, no demos, nothing. And it was up to the guys to go, okay, how do we come up with something that's going to be of substance in this short amount of time? Because we've just signed to a major label. They're not going to want to wait. We got to get something to them. So they learned to write under pressure. They learned to, write with a deadline. They learned to kind of use songwriting structure at this point. It's not just 16 riffs in one part kind of thing. They're learning how to write tracks. They're learning how to write songs. There's very clearly a shitload of riffs on this album. Like almost so many your head will spin. It was released on August 31st of 2004 in Austin. What other record came out that same day?
Man, I think there might be some tour occurring to kind of celebrate both of these, right? The Big Whale record.
The big
Free
Whale
Willy.
record.
Mastodon's Free Willy.
Whale sounds.
Whale sounds, yeah. Leviathan,
Perfect.
Yes, of course.
Which is, again, as you said, there's a tour that's promoting that this summer for the 20th anniversary. Hopefully we might get some remasters or reissues kind of associated with those. It'd be nice to have that. Two bands, again, that are lumped in this same kind of umbrella of a subgenre that sound completely different. Which one of those albums, because we've all heard those albums, would you think would be the more accessible album and sell the more records?
I would say this one.
Really?
To be honest. Yeah.
Interesting.
I was, even as a kid, I went, there's no way in hell this band's going to stay on this major label. Because like, it's that aggressive.
I mean, I think Mastodon's aggressive, but it's so fucking mathy that it seems less, like it seems too technically driven to be accessible to people. Not that, like, the drummer on this Lamb of God album is really fucking good. I'm not trying to say they're like bad musicians or anything, but like those Mastodon fucks are playing in like 17 time signatures.
I could see that. I could see it being like, I could see where Dylan's coming from as far as like maybe lyrically or like how abrasive it can be at times, I guess. More so with like Randy's vocals, I think are like definitely, but I could definitely see, myself perhaps like if I were 14 years old and I hear this guy yelling fuck on a record and like, being taken up in that. But I think as far as musically, yeah, it's very hooky. It's got a lot of riffs. I think it's maybe easier to catch an earworm. Not to say that Mastodon doesn't have that. It's just, I think this is maybe more mid-paced, maybe like it's consistent all the way through, as I mentioned before. So I don't know.
As a kid, knowing that, obviously I didn't know those two records came out on the same day. I probably bought them on around the same time and just didn't put together that they had released the same time period. But I remember hearing this and just thinking, well, my world had already changed hearing that Slipknot record and just going, this is what I want to listen to. This doesn't sound like some of the Korn stuff I'd heard before. This doesn't sound like kind of the new metal stuff I've been used to hearing or anything. This is its own thing.
Sure.
And then I was introduced to this band I randomly left a movie theater one night in the town I was living in, and we walked to kind of a generic 7-Eleven. And there's this guy behind the counter. There's always we've all walked into a convenience store, and there's always been a guy that's like got a forearm tattoo or has like an eyebrow ring or something like that. And I don't know what I was wearing, but there were I picked up a Revolver issue and picked up a Revolver.
I picked up a Revolver when I saw him.
I picked up an issue of Revolver magazine, and the guy was like, oh, I don't even remember how the conversation initiated, but he was like, here. And he wrote down a list of different bands. He's like, check these out, check these bands out, check all of these out.
Before we carry on this conversation, I want to know, did you pay this forward when you worked at a gas station, Dylan?
As much as I could, yeah. Yes.
So you were this person to someone.
Yeah, as much as I could. Luckily,
there's a bald guy down at the Mapco.
Hey, man, I had hair then.
That's true. You did.
The forehead was still a normal size at this point. But no, I definitely did. But he wrote it down. and a friend of mine, we were both there. And I just remember like I probably had $60 saved up or something at that point from like mowing lawns and everything. And I said, fuck it. I got to go get a couple of these records. And I know I bought this one. I think I bought the Shadows Fall record. And I might have bought the Killswitch record all at the same time. So those hit. And I think I got Mastodon, like I mowed a lawn and got it the following week or something. So it was all just like in that same lump of time. And again, you put on the opening track and it's just like, right, it's all there. The Headbangers Ball soundtrack I bought had it on there. The video was everywhere.
Guitar
and
Hero.
it was in fucking Guitar. And that was a bit later. Like I didn't have a PlayStation 2 or anything like that at this point. But being able to like hang out with a couple friends of mine and they're like, oh, here's this thing. It's like, yeah, I've been talking about this for a couple years now. But I'm happy you guys are into it, and I'm happy you guys have joined in on the party.
Just give him a little head pat.
Yeah, just
good boy.
Wow.
Swindle, you've never met him, but Austin's met him a handful of times. I've got a very close friend named Norm. So during this time period, I used to make like people would pay me a couple dollars, and I would buy CDRs, and they're like, "Hey, just make a mix CD for me." Sure. It was all illegally downloaded shit, including things that I'd bought. So I'd make it. Norm would always want like, hey, find me, make me a CDR of classic rock stuff. Okay. I'd always fuck with them though. I would always put at least one extreme thing at the end of the album. Like I think I put Duality at the end of one. But the one in particular, and I think he still has the CDR, it's probably unplayable, had this had Laid to Rest at the end of it. And he goes, yeah, I thought the album was over. Like he was at his mother's house. He had the stereo on his room, and that thing kicks in. He's like, nope, not ready for that.
Yeah.
And it slowly started to kind of build on him. And I would do that to Norm a lot. He'd like, make me another one. I'd sneak something else in, or I was like, I got to get somebody into this shit. And I got to pay it forward, as Swindle brought up. And with this is such a quintessential album for me, for Norm, and our friendship as well, that, I mean, we've seen them. I believe Norm and I have seen them together a couple times. Oh, Norm was at that show at Marathon. Yeah,
sure
absolutely. But yeah, this is just a really, really, it's nostalgia without feeling like nostalgia. It's not that marketed shit where it's like, oh, here's this thing from the 90s. Remember Tamagotchi, kids? Feed your pets while ignoring your pets, that kind of thing. But this thing it blew my mind when I heard it. It just being 14 years old and only knowing like Saint Anger and stuff like that beforehand, and getting this and going, okay, this is this new thing. It's not a classic record. It's not, the Black Album. It's not Guns N' Roses. It's not Master of Puppets. It's entirely different, and it was so extreme to my ear at the time.
So you kind of mentioned Devin Townsend had produced the previous record. They have a new producer on this record.
Machine.
And, yeah, which I wasn't super familiar with. Like, some of the bands that I saw that he had produced, I've certainly heard via like high school people, or maybe stuff that you or even Matt or Graham, our good friend, had listened to. Some of his credits include Clutch, Chiodos, 4 Year Strong, Suicide Silence, 18 Visions, Armor for Sleep.
It's my favorite butt rock record that you just mentioned there. He did an 18 Visions butt rock record. Kind of sounds like a weird modern version of Stone Temple Pilots. It's fucking great. Sounds nothing like the rest of their music, but it's like it's definitely an acquired taste, but I fucking love it.
So he owned this studio in Hoboken, the Machine Shop, where I believe the album was mixed and everything like that. But it seemed like, just based on some of the reading we did, that even this record, they still kind of kept him at like an arm's length in a way. Like they, this guy has like some accolades. Like he certainly, I'm sure, knew how to produce and record bands at the time, but maybe they're still like a little hesitant to give up a little bit more control of this record.
Yeah, that's absolutely it. The band, from what I've gathered from knowing this band and watching interviews and DVDs and everything, they did not want to be misconstrued as being something else. They wanted to control their vision of what the band should be. And they've done a very good job of it throughout the years. They've been able to kind of take the band in its own route, and they've become a legendary band in their own right. But during this time period, they're still very young. This is album number 4. You know, the band has been around the block for quite some time. You know, they were touring in, you know, the early 90s and playing shows to 20 people and so on and so forth. They'd probably been taken advantage in many, 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 many ways at this point. And when you bring in an outsider and go, okay, he's not a musician. He's not like Devin, who can come in and give us like input on sound or anything like that. We just want him to come in and hit play and go, that's a good take. And you have to learn to go, okay, a producer has to come in and produce. He's not going to make you change what you sound like. He's just ultimately hoping to help you make the best version of you can, right? And that took some learning. And luckily with this record, with Machine working on it, they learned that he's there to do that. And they obviously worked with them, you know, a few years later on the following record. But on this record in particular, they really didn't allow many input except for one track. And that would be the second single off the album, Now You've Got Something to Die For. Randy probably had the biggest, influence from Machine on this album, because he's never had anybody produce him vocally. Never. It was always just like, hey, he mentions in the Decibel Hall of Fame induction for this album that on New American Gospel, he just basically came in, recorded the vocals in like a day or a day and a half, and was like, all right, we're good. That's it. I'm just doing my thing. I'm screaming into a microphone. And then with Palaces, because of time constraints, he had to record with somebody locally late at night to get it. So he never really had any production on those vocals. So this was a new kind of step in his career for him.
The one thing too that like I think any outsider of the band can see, and I kind of appreciate as well, is like, you know, not only are they pretty, again, from an outsider's perspective, it's like they're pretty consistent as far as like their sound and how they approach songwriting, but like also their visual aesthetic has pretty much been the same for years. Ken Adams, or Ken with a 3 for the E.
It's 2004.
Hell yeah. So I mean, the album artwork alone, you know, even though like I hadn't really gotten to this band, seriously until recently, you know what their whole visual and art style is like. And yeah, they've used the same guy for decades. And I like that. I like when you kind of know what you're getting, you know what, like maybe different takes. I mean, shit, like
it's the Iron Maiden thing.
The most recent record, again, still like what, Omens or whatever.
Yep.
Same artist. It's all there. So you know what to expect. They have a look. It's a vibe. You get it. And
yeah.
It definitely ties in with Ken. Yeah,
it absolutely does. And the piece of art for this album is still many clips of the piece of art that's used for this record is still being used today in different, live settings or different pieces of merchandise. I mean, people have the birds tattooed on them. And it's very much when you think of Lamb of God, you kind of think of, there's this weird variant of the American flag that they use. It's like black and white, has a couple has like 1 or 2 stars on it. And there's also the warbird that's on this record. And it definitely shows that having the right artist that can depict what your band is trying to put across can really affect. I mean, let's look at a Converge, for instance. Obviously, Jake does all of their artwork. You can look at a Converge record without seeing the logo, the label, anything like that's a Converge record. You just know it. It's synonymous, right? Look at Jane Doe and look at Dark Horse. You could even compare look at Jane Doe and look at Axe to Fall. You could even compare those 2 records and go, this is definitely the same band,
sure,
right? It's very reminiscent. And with all of this band's kind of catalog, you can look at their artwork all spread out in front of you, and it's like, oh yeah, this is definitely the same band. Because you look at that's kind of brings this question to me. What's the first piece of art of this band you ever saw?
Probably this record. Honestly.
Probably this record.
Yeah,
just that green and red.
Yeah,
100%. I was going to either assume that or the Sacrament record with the chalice.
I mean, I would say there's that as well, but definitely this record with the bird. And again, not knowing maybe even what this band sounds like outside of that the song, the signature song, but you could almost picture it in your head, like maybe even like just like someone brings it up and your first thought might be the album artwork or maybe some of the riffs that you know by heart, you know.
I can say that I've owned this on CD probably 4 to 5 times. I've worn them out, bought them again. But I was able to find like a vinyl copy within the last couple of years. And to be able to sit down with something that large and really see the artwork and see the detail. And I mean, for years, I didn't really pay attention to the artwork as much because it's like, oh yeah, I know the warbirds, but I don't know what's in it. And you look at it, it's like all these wood cuttings of these rats and people carrying bodies and all sorts of stuff. It's like, oh, this is a lot deeper than I initially thought. You know, and at fucking 14, what do you know, right? You just know, like, it's a cool sounding record. This is great. It's nothing I've ever heard before. You know,
Or
it's
bad.
Yeah. Bush is a moron. Like, you know, even at 14, I fucking knew that. I mean, when the Smart Brothers jeb, I mean, come the fuck on.
Like, well, I love, don't you love that they've turned him into the adorable old man now? Like, he's like, oh yeah. Well, he's like
a fucking war
he's such
criminal.
a cute war criminal.
I love one of my favorite and probably one of the saddest The Onion pieces is like George W. Bush painting the children that he murdered in the war, and there's just like slaughtered fucking babies in the corner, and he's just like,
yeah, we just like completely forgot. Like even I felt like even at the time, you knew like, you know, after like maybe the first few years after like 9/11 had like kind of, you know, occurred. And then everybody like, I thought everybody like, oh, no one likes this guy. Like, fuck. And then we just suddenly retconned him.
God, George W. The Bush era had good music. I will say that.
Sure.
You had to dig a little deep to get to it, but it was fucking there. And this is a highly recommended record if you've got a problem with our current establishment or our establishment during that period. Listen to this record, and Randy's going to let you know how he feels. There's no he's not mincing words on this record.
Well, should we get into it?
Let's fucking get into this thing.
Let's go.
I want to hear what you guys thought. I mean, we've all heard this track. We know this track. It's a great album opener.
I didn't know it opened the record, to be completely
Really?
honest with you.
I was
no idea.
Very
Wow.
fucking surprised. And there's not like an intro. Like
Just goes
I would
right
have
into it.
expected if I had known that it opened the record, I would have at least thought they like had a little instrumental warm up into the fucking song, but it was like like right off the fucking rip.
There's a lot of that throughout. I mean, I think this song as a whole is like a very good indication of like what kind of like rhythmic stylings. Like they love a gallop. These boys love a gallop.
This is challenging shit too.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Again, all that right hand stuff on this record, it's all there.
If you've ever sat down to learn any of the riffs off this record, it's not even just the right hand, it's the left hand with like where the next note lands. It's really challenging shit. And the band still does that and writes these catchy songs. You know, this kind of sounds like Into the Pit, very, very slightly. Like there's even a joke that Mark Morton has said to Eric Peterson. He's like, man, I owe you some money.
Yeah.
He's like, I owe you a few dollars for this one. And I will say that I was in a band I was probably 15 or 16 by this point. And it's myself, another friend of mine named Frank, and this older guy named Matt. And we basically played the A side of this record. And he's like, here are the songs you need to go learn. I was like, this is like the first half of the Lamb of God record. He's like, go learn. I was like, fuck. Because like during this time period, like we all had like Walkmans or variations of that. And, you know, they didn't have the best sound quality. If you were like Swindle and I, you probably got the $20 one at max. And, you know, the lowest cost one that had the anti-skip to it.
Oh, yeah.
And
no, I definitely been on the bus before and hit a pothole and fucking... Why am I on track? I'm on track 7 now. What the fuck?
You just got to hold it in the air.
And those headphones didn't really work, especially if you're like a bass player, like I am and Swindle is. Like it was just, I guess I'm just going to play what the guitars play. And learning this stuff was like, okay, I really got to hone in on this. But we learned the whole A side of this record. And this track in particular was a motherfucker to learn. Because back then you don't go like, I need a metronome, I need this. You're just like, I guess I just got to attempt to play it bad for a few days.
That galloping rhythm is pretty much the whole song.
Yep. Doesn't let up.
Which is fine.
It doesn't let up. You know, it's got those great pinch harmonics and kind of like the verse structure. It's got that weird kind of like dissonant guitar melody that plays over it. Randy's got that great kind of spoken word.
Oh,
kind of very like
deep. That deep ass voice on Randy.
Kind of far beyond driven, kind of Pantera-esque thing.
Sounds like the best song they did from that record.
Oh, that's funny.
I'm kidding.
This band gets a lot of Pantera comparisons, and I don't necessarily always hear it.
I think it's there. There's some songs on here.
There's a little bit there, but it definitely gets more so than I think they need to get. I think it's just because they're from the South kind of thing. That's how I've always thought it.
I think there's some stuff on here. I certainly hear the Bay Area thrash shit way more than I would have heard.
A shitload of Meshuggah as well.
There you go. No.
With the drumming in particular. But this track like opens up. As Swindle said, it's the same kind of pace and rhythm throughout the whole song. And what do you get in the middle of this track? A big fucking breakdown, like just enunciated with fuck. Like, yeah. I mean, see who gives a fuck. Like, it's perfect. You know, the vocals are dry. Like, there's not a shit ton of reverb on this song. Very dry and direct. Randy's got a very recognizable voice. I've always kind of thought of him as like this very vulturous kind of sounding character. And it's like, oh yeah, I get it. And like he cuts through, you know his voice. You can hear him on tracks by other bands and you know his voice. And it's like, yep, he's kind of the guy. Like he's got his own sound. He doesn't sound like anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I think listening to this like on repeat for the past like few days, even in like the car, you know, it kind of reminded me of our Kill Switch episode where just it is very like a dry vocal thing. There's also some effects we'll get into.
And a couple tracks that work very well.
Like, oh yeah, I remember this from another record, or like this was the year for that. But it was like very like he's like it almost feels like he's kind of standing right in front of you yelling. It's just that dry.
There's a video from the album prior to this. I believe it's for the song. I think it's for the song Ruin. And he's literally in the video shoot. He's about 6 inches away from somebody and he's just screaming at them. And it's actors. He's just screaming at them for probably 6 hours. It's like, okay, I get it. I get why this band is terrifying.
Some fucking Daffy Duck shit. just fucking spitting all over people's face.
I mean, there's a video for this song too. I definitely saw this, of course. So
absolutely. I mean, this was in my kind of early eras of listening to this music, hearing this and going, am I supposed to be listening to stuff like this? You know, is this something I should be listening to? Should I fear things? Being able to stay up late at night watching Headbangers Ball and like see this video. Well, I had whatever version of cable at this point in time, but there was the music choice channels and you could like watch those and it would play it and it would play the track and it would always have, it was kind of like when you go to the movies and they have all the trivia shit before. It was essentially that with music. And it would be like, oh, this album was recorded in Virginia. They were known as Burn the Priest or something. So like getting that information also like, I mean, God, this is an anthem. This is this band's anthem. You know, no matter what other track this band comes up with, that's a really big single or anything before or after, this is the band's anthem.
Yeah. I doubt there's a live show where this band hasn't played this song.
No,
since,
right. Since, correct.
Right.
We dig into Hourglass.
There's another one I think that is like pretty.
Whew.
Again, I mean, like that first half of the record, it's pretty strong. But I think this is another one. Some more like galloping riffs, maybe more. If the first song, I've heard a lot of people, you know, make connections to addiction and the Iraq War, but I feel like this one is more like direct in its critique of what was going on at the time. The biggest thing, again, to bring up Testament, there is a part that has like the kind of double guitar harmony kind of scale rundown in this song where I'm like,
are you talking about that fucking gnarly riff in the middle?
Yeah, it's like towards the middle
so-
of the
break.
song. It's like just those lead lines kind of going back and forth with each other. Yeah, it's pretty cool. There's also one other thing too that I wanted to mention, kind of rooted in the Bay Area, or I should say California, because I believe they're still located in LA. But the Megadeth song "In My Darkest Hour," there's a riff that sounds exactly like that in this song.
Ooh.
For sure.
Oh,
Yeah.
I definitely have to go back and check
Yeah.
that. Oh, I mean, they're definitely influenced by Megadeth, 100%. I mean, it's funny that we're talking about that era of Megadeth because, yeah, look who we got guested on the record. Different
Actually,
era, but it's still Megadeth nonetheless.
This is true. Yeah, this is
Yep.
that was on the record after, but yes, we do have a former member of Megadeth later in the record. But yeah, what do you guys think about this song?
One thing I know is there were definitely some two steps to the chorus of Hourglass.
Yeah. Hourglass is, again, it's like you got the single right up front, and then what do you follow it with? Something just as fucking intense. Like you kick right into it. This band is, the sequencing of this record is just undeniable, and this band takes a lot of pride, and I think with making sure the record sounds good all the way through. It's not like lulls in it. It flows in a certain way. And Hourglass is, again, a classic track. You're probably not going to get too many shows where they don't play this track. At least when I was growing up, there was some song that somebody wanted to learn or like try to like show off. It's like, oh, I can play the Faded Line. Or sorry, I can play Hourglass. I can play the Hourglass riff. And there's a couple clips of them kind of showing how to play it. It's not as simple as it seems. But it's a lot. And those harmonies that Austin was bringing up, where it's like very much those Testament style harmonies, like there's just a certain tonality that Testament has with it. Probably the most consistent band in thrash metal, to be honest. Let's face it.
Yeah, even heavier later, I thought.
Oh yeah,
in a good way. Like
yeah, like
they
that
didn't
band's
just-
not really put out a clunker.
Yeah.
And it's the Testament worship is all over this album, 100%. And then we get into our third track, which is the second single from their album. So the video came out for this, and it was kind of a clip fest. It was a clip of all the live stuff that they were putting together for a DVD called Philadelphia. And it was, again, I'm assuming it was just to kind of heighten the success this band had had on this record. And Epic was like, let's do a live record, because during this period of time, live records were still a thing. And I don't know how live it actually was. But again, it just added more kind of fodder to the band of, here's more stuff. It's a lot of the same tracks, but you can listen to this live album and hear songs from our whole career, even an old Burn the Priest song. You know, you can dig in, listen to all that. You can kind of see what we're doing behind the scenes on tour. It was produced very well. It sounds good. It was a presentation. I think the thing went gold. I think a live DVD went gold for them. And the artwork was done by Ken as well. But this track is a little more straightforward. This is the track that Machine had a lot of hand in helping everybody out. I think he really pushed him to go really all in with the chorus, not necessarily being melodic vocally, but being catchy and using that as the hook. It's probably the simplest track on the album. Not necessarily saying that the parts themselves are simplistic, because they're not. It's pretty challenging shit. It's a chromatic riff, but like it kind of, can get you lost here and there. I remember this was one I had a lot of trouble learning how to play, was this one. But again, it's got essentially two breakdowns in it, a really fast one at the middle, and then that just slow, gnarly one at the end. My favorite vocal part in this song is where it's just like going in on, and just Randy says burn, and it just kicks off from it. It's great. And lyrically, it's, again, it's an anti-war song. It's all over the fucking song. Like if you really dig into these lyrics, he's not mincing words. He's going right for the throat on this thing.
I really like the riff. I think it's kind of near the end with the three harmonized string bends in the
do.
Yeah. I really like that riff. Also, that opening riff, the chromatic one, that riff is so different than the rest of the album at this point, because so much of the album has been like the kind of open note riffs,
Triplet fill.
gallopy. Yeah.
It always makes me think of, Swindle, you'll get a laugh out of this, Mr. Mustache for some reason from Bleach. It always makes me think of that because that's a chromatic riff.
Also, not pertaining to the riffs, but on one of the subsequent listens for me, I noticed the metal sounding snare. This is the first song that happens in on this album.
I noticed that today for the first time ever.
Same.
Because there's a couple tracks later that do it to kind of really impact. Also, this has an 808 in it. In that burn part, there's an 808 that kicks in. It's very subtle.
I think that may happen again later, because I took a note about that on the faded line, the next song.
Oh my fucking God. Like we might as well dig into that track. Like this might be the best track on the whole album. Like the faded line is so good. Like it's got every aspect of this band in this song.
The fucking drum part with the cymbals during the fast, the really fast triplet parts. As a drummer, that was the thing that really hooked me.
Hey man, Chris Adler was on the cover of every drum magazine. He was in guitar magazines talking about drums. He was the guy. Like there hadn't been a guy that had been talked about for drums in this genre since probably Joey Jordison, years prior. And since then he's developed a career. He's still known as the drum guy. Like he's not with the band anymore, but he's done so much fuck. He went on to play on the Megadeth record Dystopia. He played on a Protest the Hero record. He's done tons of stuff. Like he is as close to like that style of drummer as you can get. Like he was just the guy that went, I have to be the best that I can be at what I'm doing. His feet are crazy. It's not just straight double kick the entire time. He is doing some wild shit that I've never heard before. Even at that point, I couldn't even fathom it back then. It was like, oh yeah, double kick's a thing. But you know, when you sit down and you try to learn all those different things that he's doing, the cymbal fills that he's doing, Chris is a great drummer. I'll never take that away from him. You know, that's what's really weird about kind of those 4 or 5 records that I chose from 2004. Like they all have very good drummers, but they're all different in their own right. Like you look at like a Jason Bittner from Shadows Fall, like completely different drummer, maybe a little bit more classic in the heavy metal style, right? Just double kick, kind of 4 on the floor. You look at like, you look at Justin from Killswitch Engage, not really doing a ton on that thing, but you listen to it and it's like, oh, okay, he's doing what the role wants him to do. And then we got another drummer to dig into with the next record that we'll talk about at some point, who is, I think, the best drummer that's ever existed in this type of music, being Bron Daylor. But Chris is a stellar fucking drummer, an impenetrable drummer.
The bass playing, the double bass, just the way that was kind of stylistically applied to this song, I think was super noticeable. Vocally too, I thought was great. There was one part, there's some like screams in here that Randy's doing that I was like, is Max Cavalera on this fucking track? Like it sounded wild. And come to find that even there's some connection there. I think Randy even ended up on a Soulfly record at some point.
He sure did.
I was like, damn, that's pretty wild. But yeah, his range is pretty crazy. I mean, there's like maybe more of the consistent thing that he does throughout the record, but there's like the highs, and then there's like even some really fucking low. There's one song in particular where it's like so low.
This is the first track on the album that actually has a very melodic chorus, like Walk the Faded Line, and but then it's kicked off by that breakdown at the end of it. This song's got, again, 2 or 3 breakdowns in it. It's got that cool kind of buzzsaw guitar effect that plays in one of them. This is a perfect track to me. This is a perfect track. It's well crafted. It's catchy. It's memorable. The band definitely starts going more in a direction post this album where the songs are a little bit more kind of song structured wise. And this might be the first representation of that. There's a shitload of riffs in it, but it definitely moves towards that area. Omerta. Omerta.
Got the spoken word intro.
It's got the spoken word intro with a little bit of reverb in the background. As a kid, I didn't necessarily care for the spoken word part. Doesn't really bother me, but I didn't necessarily care for it. But hearing that kick into this like slow groove-ridden part that just pounds into oblivion. This might be one of the longer tracks on the album too. But this was always a kind of set highlight anytime the band would play live was this track. Because he would still come out and do the spoken word part. It wasn't just a track playing in the background. He'd grab a mic, do it. Whether he was hammered, whether his voice was shot, he just did it. But it's a very anthemic kind of sounding song to me.
One of the things that I noticed that I really liked is technically the choruses, they played the full riff 1.5 times through, like a really weird thing. And also I really like that in the chorus, the cymbals switch from hitting like on the quarter note to hitting on the offbeat in the middle of the chorus.
This track seems, and you completely hit on this. The track seems far simpler than it actually is. They definitely put the time and effort to go, what can we do to make this interesting without it just being, here's this 4/4 track, straight in.
Pantera grooves. This was the song that I was like, okay, this sounds more directly like Pantera, whether it was influenced or not. It was just like, oh, okay. I mean, it'd be hard to, one of the biggest bands ever at that point in time, you're going to find some influence on that. So,
I mean, this is the year Dimebag
right,
passed away, right?
Sure.
So like 04, again, kind of a big deal there. I don't think these guys got the tour with Damage plan at any facet. A lot of the bands during this period did. But again, being kind of a metal band from the South, you're kind of tied to that, especially if you're in the thrash vein or if you're in kind of the groove vein, you're going to get a lot of ties to that band. I didn't bring this up earlier and I meant to. Lamb of God formed in essentially 94, but they were really into this band from Richmond called Breadwinner. And Breadwinner's like a math rock band. I'd actually finally listened to their record to kind of prepare for this. And it's like, oh man, if you listen to what Lamb of God sounds like in 2024, you're not going to hear it. But if you go back to maybe some of their earlier era, their first 3 records, you can hear it and go, okay, I hear it, but it's just off-kilter riffs, kind of weird song structures, weird timing, playing parts 1.5 times as opposed to playing it twice or 3 times or whatever it may be. So those odd meters and odd time signatures are in their blood for sure. So we're hitting the B side of the record. And as a kid, I probably didn't appreciate this as much. And that's just because the front half of this record is so heavy. Like it's just boom, 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 boom. You're not letting up. And it's almost like Omerta ends. It's like it's kind of like the old vinyl thing, right? You always end it on kind of a ballad or a cruiser track. I don't want to miss this, but Omerta is Italian for a vow of silence. Okay. It's very much a mafioso kind of thing. Randy's a very educated person. So I'm sure he was doing some reading at this point in time about things and probably just dug into that. And it's kind of fitting with the whole war vibe of it too, of being like, hey, this is, you're sworn in to do this, but this is really what you're going to be doing. But we go Blood on the Scribe, and Blood on the Scribe, as I've gotten older, has become one of my favorite tracks from this band. It's a quicker track. And it's got some of the wildest fucking right hand shit in it with the different triplets in between. But this might be the track that sounds the closest to that As the Palaces Burns era. A little bit more like Gothenburg-esque, a little bit more metalcore-esque in just some of the structure, but still definitely rooted like deep in the Bay Area for sure.
The thing I noted with this track too, and I mentioned this earlier, was I think definitely by this point in the record, it was very clear that we had time to really write out what these things were doing. I mean, I know you mentioned earlier that, or I don't know if you did mention this earlier, but you know, they'd quit their day jobs and such. I think they worked as like, maybe some of them even, I read, worked as like roofers at a certain point. So you have like all of this time now to really focus on songwriting. It to me, it felt like, okay, I don't have anywhere else to be, so I'm just going to play this riff over and over again and really kind of figure out where this is going to go next. And I think this band transitions very well. It doesn't necessarily, it's not just cut paste. It's like everything makes sense.
It feels
for what
natural.
It needs to be. Yeah.
It feels completely natural. And again, you brought up a really good point. This is the first time the band didn't have to work day jobs. You know, they were making money from the band. You know, they signed a record deal with a major label. I'm sure there was a bit of an advance for that to help them all out. You know, but at that point they were like, this is our job. We have to treat it this way. 5 to 6 days a week, working on this album, 8 to 12 hours a day. They had no children, like no real jobs or whatever you want to refer to it. Like they were just, this is their job. This is what we're dedicating all of our time to. This is what we have to do. This has to make an impression. And we just got done with the record and we have nothing left over for it. We've barely toured for the record prior to it. So being able to have that amount of time away to go, okay, we can actually write and, you know, pre-pro things and see if it works and see if it doesn't work, you know, as opposed to going, it kind of works. Let's get it, you know, put it to tape, that sort of thing. But you're right. This is a great representation of time and effort spent putting a song together. Swindle, you had as we were speaking off air about this album, you had a pretty good recollection of this next track, One Gun.
I don't know if they brought in a completely different snare or if they just put fucking wild reverb on it, but there's a snare on both breakdowns that just has a very it sounds like the clown from Slipknot came in and just smashed on that keg just for the breakdown.
I thought about that at like maybe a little earlier. There's the song fucking that we just talked, The Faded Line. I thought there was like some of that like maybe buried in there a little bit.
There's some industrial shit kind of buried in the midst of it and sound sampling for sure.
Oh, I mean, even the fucking the track that you mentioned, Machine had more of a
now you got something
writing.
to die for.
The ending kind of even like has some kind of machine, like, oh, the machines are turning, kind of like War Pigs-esque, kind of like the sounds of war kind of are very like in there. But yeah, I like that you mentioned that with this track as well.
Again, this is a great just riffy song at the back half of the album. This might be, in my opinion, maybe the track if it comes on, it's going to be the track I kind of like pay attention to the least. It's still a great track. It's not as memorable to me as maybe the rest of the album. But that's no fault. You know, it fits into an album that's got 11 great songs on it.
First song on the album with the guitar solo, I think.
Yes.
Maybe.
Yep. You're right. It is. That's a wild thing too, to think about, because this was kind of during the era where guitar solos weren't as prevalent in this type of music. You know, the big album that comes up is Saint Anger and no guitar solos. It's going to date us to a time. And a lot of the records that were coming out around it in the underground, they didn't have a ton of solos either. Like there's kind of an outlier like The War Within that had solos all over it. But this one doesn't have a ton, but it's got enough that it feels natural. It doesn't feel like the band is saying no solos. It's just, did the songs need them? Not necessarily.
I think that's a really good point. When I listened to it, I didn't even really make that connection just because there's like already so much going on with like how the riffs are written that you just like I don't even think about it.
I mean, later that next to last song is almost a whole solo. Like,
oh yeah, for sure, yeah.
Almost the whole fucking song is a solo. So,
Break You. This might be. I love the lyrics on this track. I think this is more of a personal track than anything, but it could also be interpreted as kind of going through military training or anything like that. I love this track. I like the title. I like Randy's kind of venom in his voice in this track. It's very much a I mean, it could be interpreted in many ways, and that's kind of the key to a cool song, and a great song is it's open for interpretation. And again, just a great B-side track, you know. It falls in line with how the rest of the album sounds. It doesn't feel like this doesn't need to be on the album. It feels like it fits right in where it's at.
This hammer-on riff that I think is like the first riff of the song, and also like about 40 seconds in, they changed to the next riff, and I was like, somebody got their ass beat to that riff 40 seconds into the song. They got pummeled.
That's the thing I remember most about seeing them at Marathon, where it's like, as soon as this band came on, the fucking shirts came off, the back tattoos were heavily prevalent, and a bunch of good old boys running towards the center of the venue for sure.
Wall
of
of death.
You
Fucking
guys,
wall of death shit.
no, just like, well,
these guys were just beating the hell out of each other.
So I was like, y'all can have that. I'll be over here.
It is really funny to me, kind of the shit that this album is about, and the people that I think
Thank you.
Yeah.
like Lamb of God the most.
Yes. It's like the people who, I think there's an element of like kind of similar to the Rage Against the Machine thing, where it's just like, why do artists have to be so political or whatever? And I'm like,
Yeah.
this band seems like it's been pretty political the whole time. And it's like,
Right.
I feel like there maybe is like, unfortunately, a sect of fans, as with all bands, as we've kind of learned with, you know, some of our deep dive stuff, that maybe they're not necessarily listening to what the band is saying, and more just like, hell yeah, brother, riffs go hard.
I will say that that's a good point, and it also shows too that the band being able to write the way they do leaves their tracks kind of open for interpretation, right? You know, they have a broad span of the type of individual this band can attract, because for every song on this album, I'm sure they've got a fan that was like, hey, I served during this period. I understand what you're talking about. I get it. Like I support this, but I still served kind of situation. You know, I had family at home. I had to do this. I had to do that. And they were just being puppeteered the entire time. And they're like, oh, there's this great band. But for every person like that, yes, there's going to be someone that just is like, my God, he says fuck a lot. I love it. You know, God, just bring it on. I get to like run into a steel beam at a venue. Like, let's do it. You know, those people are absolutely welcome at shows like this. And sometimes it's like, you got to have that little bit of madness to it. It's like, you don't want it to be so safe that it's like, oh, everybody's fine. There's going to be a little bit of like numbskullery involved in a show like this. And I've seen this band, I think 4 times at this point. I've seen them in varying size venues. I've seen some goofy shit at like Lamb of God shows. I've seen some shit go down. I think the first time I saw them was the New Daisy Theater in like 2007. And that's a venue that's not really set up amazing. All of their kind of like splits are pipes. Like it's all set up like those are the barricades, and like you'll get rammed into those. And I remember like coming out with like impressions of the pipes on like the lower part of my stomach and my hips. But like people were murking each other to like this. That was about 3 years after this album, and they were murking each other in that small area, like those little confined spaces. But yeah, this is a track that for sure could be interpreted as being numerous things across the board.
Next song, What I've Become.
Love it. I think Mark Morton described it as kind of being like a very quick kind of punk song to them. Just very kind of that attitude. There's a song on their album called Wrath. There's a song on their album Wrath called Contractor that's very much in the same kind of vibe. It's just straightforward, just very quick, very abrupt. I love the riffing in this. Again, just a really quick, gnarly, fast song.
I mean, I always thought it was cool, you know, maybe even like later on getting into underground music where it's like a band like, you know, fellow Richmond, Virginia Municipal Waste, and you hear like, oh yeah, like that guy was just always around. So like there is like ties to the punk and hardcore, and you know, Randy is very much a part of that, and like skateboarding culture and stuff. So it comes really as no surprise, but it was, I think this was a cool track like that for sure.
It's got a great vibe. It's got that triplet vibe again to it.
Yeah.
And that's I didn't realize that rhythm that's after the da 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 da. That's kind of just been in here for years. I mean, that's kind of like, that's a warm up I've done for years, and I never realized until like listening back and going, oh, that's where I took it from. That's that kind of right hand warm up I've done for years, and it's fitting. You know, it works. Like this could be, hey, I need to learn how to play this style of music. All right, here's an isolated just guitar tracks of this album. Just kind of, you don't necessarily have to play the notes the right way. Just learn the rhythmic part of it, and there you go. You've got thrash metal in a can.
Right.
And it's this album bridges that gap between guys that are really into the technicality of it as well as the musicality of it. Right. The song structure. You got to have the brains with the knucklehead. You got to have the brains with the brawn. Like, it's all there. Speaking of brains, though,
right,
you got an instrumental track on this record, and it's a hell of an instrumental track.
Again, I had never heard that song before, so it was kind of a nice little. I was like mowing the lawn and just kind of getting lost in it a little bit. So, yeah,
very. I mean, it's not the sample isn't as unnerving as like the fucking Magruder grind sample or
Yeah.
something like that, but.
Not much is.
No.
But it is a very unnerving sample, him saying like, we're just killing civilians and getting away with it. We're committing genocide essentially, and I'm not going to kill civilians for the Marine Corps.
Yep.
Which, again, still relevant. We're still in Afghanistan, we're still in Iraq, and there's a genocide happening in Palestine.
What a fucking time for this album to turn 20 years old, right?
Right.
Like, seriously, like it's very topical then, it's topical now. There are political records out there, but you don't hear a ton of them. And that, I don't know if that's necessarily, I don't know what the reason might be because of that. You know, I've always heard that, you know, bad leadership or bad political environment breeds really good aggressive music, or really good music in that sense. You know, the Reagan era bred hardcore punk and all sorts of things. You know, the Bush era, record like this, multiple other records. But, you know, I know it's out there. Maybe I'm just not hearing it. There are albums that have political leanings, but maybe not as direct as something like this was in 2004.
I know another thing that happened in 2004. I mean, even just like centered around like military around this time, and they still kind of use him as like the face of, you know, fallen heroes in, you know, Afghanistan. Pat Tillman, you know, former fucking NFL, like Arizona Cardinal player who opposed the war and then was killed in friendly fire. And they still, to this day, I fucking watched the Super Bowl like maybe last year, a couple years ago, and they like used him as like a poster boy for like fucking military. Cause, you know, and again, I'm a huge football fan. I love it. It's so weird how like indoctrinated like the military and like sports are, and like, I don't know. So that when I was listening to this, it kind of made me think of that a little bit. And, you know, obviously I think this happened like, you know, months before the album actually came out, but it's fucking crazy. Obviously still goes on today, and it's pretty fucking sick. Yeah.
I mean, there was a Marine that fucking self-immolated himself earlier this year.
That happened twice.
Yeah.
Didn't it?
Maybe not a Marine, but there were like a couple instances of
at the Trump trial, the initial part of that, he did that. Let's get back to this heavy fucking song though. I can't do this shit anymore. It's an instrumental track. It's fantastic. The opening line and that groove that kicks into it. This might have been the track where I really hit like, okay, there's Pantera here, like for sure. The bent notes, everything like that. And this thing moves. It's not just kind of the same. It's not the same riff the entire time. It's not the same line. Like, it moves, it flows. It's got these different chord voicings at the beginning of that are so cool and kind of highlight the intricacies of the of the track. But you get 2 guest spots on this track. Who do we have?
Reference Testament to Death in this. So you have Alex Skolnick from Testament, who is an amazing lead guitar player. You also have ex-Megadeth lead guitarist Chris Poland, who, again, another amazing guitar player. You can hear him on the first 2 records. I mean, some of those lead lines have lived, they're embedded in my DNA at this point. Like, I could never be a Chris Poland, but like, I've just always listened to those first 2 records and just always in love with his style of playing.
It's wild too that it's 2 kind of jazz influenced guys.
Yeah,
on the song.
this is true.
Because Alex has his Alex Skolnick trio that does like jazz standards and stuff.
Chris and Gar Samuelson of Megadeth were both jazz players. They didn't like come from thrash metal. So the fact that you are clearly very influenced by this style of music and also this part of the country that produced all of those bands, to have them on the record is really, really cool.
Chris was also on the last record as well. I didn't know that till recently.
Omen? Yeah.
No, he's on As the Palaces Burn.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
The record prior to this one, I should say. He was on the 03 record. Yeah, I never knew that. I knew Devin played a solo on that record, but I didn't know Chris was on it as well. Instrumental track, very much, it makes me think of like To Live Is To Die on Injustice for All. Maybe more so than like Orion or something like that. It's just a really cool, moody, but very dystopian kind of track. You know, that the sample they used from the clip is pretty haunting to hear with the music around it. And it just adds to the vibe of an already really cool record. And then we kick into the last song, which is Remorse Is For the Dead. There you go.
How do you feel about that song title, Dylan?
I mean, it's straightforward, right? It's there. I don't think there were any words being minced in this one either. Great song. I think it's a great album closer. I found a quote from Mark Morton, the guitar player, that stated that he always fights to have the last track on the album because it's such an important track to have, right? It's like you either want the first track or the last track. He goes, it needs to begin on a good point. It needs to end on a good point. And I think he hit the nail on the head with this. What I've realized with this band throughout the years and kind of watching interviews, there's 2 very dominant personalities in this band, Mark being one of them, and Randy being one of them. And Randy's he's the face of the band, right? You know, he's kind of the guy that does a ton of the interviews, does a lot of the press, but you've got Mark behind him, who is this kind of blues style guitar player writing all this like aggressive sounding shit, you know? So it's a weird dynamic for that band, especially during this period of time when they were younger and there was a lot more alcohol involved and probably a couple other substances. You know, they're bands, you know, shit happens. You got to do something to get you through the 23 hours of the day when you're not playing music. And to be able to be in a band like that is already coming from having a chip on their shoulder and coming from the underground and really grinding it hard for 10 years, like with no record label, and having this presented to you, like you have an opportunity, because that's really all it is. It's not a promise. It's not a guarantee. It's an opportunity. You know, that advance they got for this record could have very well been the last big sum of money they ever received. This record could have tanked and done nothing. This record came out of the period of time it needed to come out at, and you had all the dominoes fell. They all fell at the right time for this album. And it's very clear that this album did a lot for them and continued to help propel them forward. But first, what did you guys think of this track?
I specifically took note of whatever guitar effect is in the middle of the song. It sounds completely different than like any other of the guitar parts on the album. And then near the end, the big breakdown, there's the fucking big bends, the big guitar string bends, and the really fucking nasty guitar harmonies that are in that breakdown too.
It's kind of a signature thing for them, because you could pull a track from maybe their last 3 records and go, yep, production's different. They sound a little bit older, maybe a little bit more refined, but it's still there. It's still that thing. It's still this very mid-range focused kind of guitar sound, kind of buzzsaw kind of, has a very kind of fizzy kind of sound to it. But again, great album, 11 tracks. Maybe, in my opinion, you could have pulled one track off of it. Just keep it 10. That's just kind of where my brain goes, but 11's perfectly fine. 47 minutes, not bad either. It's not a terribly long record. You can listen to it a couple times. I know today alone, I listened to it, I think 3 times all the way through. And again, I just never wore out to me. And it still sits that way 20 years on, and I can listen to it and go, Jesus Christ, what was I presented with 20 years ago? What did I get? And it's a great record. And it's also the band's highest, or it's not the band's highest charting record, but it's the band's highest selling record. It's a gold fucking record. 2016, the album went gold. That's not something that happens very often anymore. It took them, 12 years for it to go gold. It debuted, I believe, at 27 on the Billboard 200. I think it debuted with like 35,000 copies sold. Even the band itself was like, we didn't sell a ton of copies when it came out. It's like, there were other bands in this time period that were selling far more, and Epic was happy. But then we started getting all these tours, right? Their first promotional tour for this album was Ozfest 2004.
Damn.
Yeah.
And that's a big fucking deal tour. That's like a Black Sabbath reunion tour. Judas Priest was on that. You had a lot of the kind of new wave of American heavy metal bands on there. Slipknot's headlining second stage. Lamb of God, I believe, is direct support to them on that stage. It's endless. I think Hatebreed was on that fucking tour. Super Joint Ritual, Black Label Society, Dimmu Borgir, Slayer, like huge bands on this tour. And Lamb of God doesn't even have their album out yet. They're touring based off their 03 record for it. The album comes out like halfway through the tour, and it's like it started with that, and they never got off tour for the next probably 3 to 4 years. You go from that. They had a small co-headliner with Fear Factory in the fall, and it's funny to think that they had a co-headliner with Fear Factory. Fear Factory had came back. They had a reunion. They had released a record in 2004 called Archetype. And it was a great record. It's fun. It sounds like Fear Factory, but they weren't the band they were a couple years prior. And it's wild to see Lamb of God kind of sharing co-headlining spots with them. I think Children of Bodom was direct support. And then you also had Throwdown on the tour, which I thought was cool. Lamb of God did a lot of tours with Throwdown throughout this time period as well. You go from that takes place from like October to November of 2004. They did a small European run from the end of November to I think mid to end December with As I Lay Dying and Throwdown in Europe as well. Like maybe 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. These guys are touring through the holidays. Like they're not letting up. That starts like the day or so after Thanksgiving and goes right before Christmas. But then they take a little bit of a break, and then they get an arena tour dumped right on them. The Subliminal Verses tour. You've got Shadows Fall, Lamb of God, Slipknot as kind of being the main rotating cast of bands. And then I think different regions had different openers here and there in that tour, because that was a pretty long form tour as well. But like they're playing arenas for the first time. The Ozfest shows are great. They were still running pretty tight on those. But you're playing to probably 8,000 people on a lot of those Ozfest shows. But in an arena show, it's fans to see one band in particular, and it's typically the headliner. And your buddies are on the tour with you, Shadows Fall. You've already toured with them multiple times. You've toured with Slipknot on the second stage for a full summer, doing God knows what. I think Randy's got some stories about like partying with Hatebreed and like stealing quads and running all over properties and stuff with them. I know the book he's written doesn't necessarily go into that stuff, but I would love to hear those stories at some point of like, what did a drinking Randy Bly do during like Ozfest 2004? What was going on in that? What type of like depravity was going on? What shit was going on? There was even a show around Ozfest during this time called Battle for Ozfest. kind of like a early version reality show. And basically they took a lot of these unknown bands and they would have to pull a member from each band. And then they would all be on a bus together on Ozfest. And they would end up, I think at the end of it, it was whoever outlasted it, that band got a record contract.
Weird.
I don't remember the band that won it. It wasn't a big deal, but like all of these bands got TV time. I remember Lamb of God hazed one guy really, really bad, like fucked with him, like on stage, pouring beers on him, all sorts of stuff. It's like, all right, you can't find the show anywhere. Like I haven't been able to find clips from it, anything. But that was a sign of the times too. Like all these bands were on that show. And that's, again, just showing what 2004 kind of looked like when these bands started to get popular. Ozfest was a massive deal at this point. That would make or break a band. It was kind of the heavy metal version of what Warped Tour was for a lot of bands. But anyway, they get off the Slipknot tour. There's a slight break. I do want to bring up too that Lamb of God actually got barred from playing at the Hollywood Palladium in 2005 on that Slipknot tour because of their prior name.
Wow.
It wasn't like, oh, Slipknot's fine. You know, Shadows Fall is fine. You guys were called a dirty name, weren't you? Hollywood, the Hollywood Palladium wouldn't let them. It's not in the South. It's not in like the Midwest. It's Hollywood.
It's not Rocket Town.
That's very true. That is very true. Although I've seen some questionable bands there. But there is a little bit of a break, a breather for these guys. They get to go home, wash their clothes, get the stink out. But then they get to play a couple big fucking festivals in Europe. They get to play Rock am Ring and Download, which was formerly known as Donington. Again, they're on a bill with these massive bands. You know, we talked a little bit about the the Download Festival with Nate Garrett when he was on the show. Massive festivals for a band that had probably 3 years prior or 2 years prior been playing to 150 people at VFW Hall. I think the touring really pushed this band. I think their face in front of all of these different crowds is what helped drive this band. They're a hardworking band. Even today, they may not tour the same way they did then, but they're still a very hardworking band. They're going out, they're playing a lot of shows, and they're going out with bands that they like and they want to go out with. I mean, I think they played that Slayer tour, but they did like both legs of that Slayer tour. They did the entire thing of that retirement tour.
Right.
They played the entire thing. And then you get to their essentially the final tour of this album, which is the Sounds of the Underground Festival, which again was another great festival, focusing primarily on this era. But you had bands like Gwar, you had High on Fire, Clutch, Poison the Well. The Red Chord did a couple stops on this year of the tour, and this was before Metal Blade signed them. This was a big deal. There was another DVD kind of released for this tour, and they were playing to some large crowds. They were like a surprise headliner. It was announced, I think Clutch was the original headliner, and there's like, oh, there's a surprise band, and you get the kind of underground heroes of the era at this point in time. So the band did a ton of touring. The band proved itself. The band made fans out of all of these crowds. Maybe people weren't as cynical about music how they are now. We have everything kind of in front of us. We can look at everything. We're like, I've heard this before. Whether you heard Lamb of God before or something like this album before, you knew it was good. You could hear it. You could see it. You could feel it. And you got great album. You got great singles from the album. You've got the band was still having videos played on MTV and MTV2. Views was around at this point. And I mean, YouTube hadn't even started at this point. I think YouTube started in 2005.
Literally, there's on the flyer you provided for download, there's a Napster stage, like just to show you what kind of era this is in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this was a big deal band, and they've cemented their legacy with this, and they got a gold record out of it. They've had albums debut in the top 10, the top 5. I think Wrath debuted at number 2. I think their album after this, Sacrament, debuted at number 8. I think it's gold or it's almost gold at this point. they might be, this era of bands might be one of the last eras to have, like, heavy bands in particular, to have like that type of certification. You know, those don't really matter anymore necessarily because of the way music is kind of digested at this point. You know, we all still buy records, right? Like all three of us, you know, we're kind of the minority here when it comes to stuff like that. We buy
coasters.
records.
You mean fucking coasters?
Big coasters, big drinks.
Yeah.
I mean, we still buy them, but it's digested differently. You know, I heard a quote recently that was, when you're on tour, you're not necessarily playing music, you're promoting your clothing brand. And that really kind of hit me in the gut. It was like, oh, fuck, he's right. I don't know how I've never put that together. And that's very fine. And I get it, but it's still just like, fuck, for younger people that want to play music, especially this forum, you know, if they want to go, I'd really love to go on tour. I bet it'd be great. It can be, and it will be, but it's just understanding what it is and where it could be. But, you know, getting off kind of a rant there, it's a fantastic record. The record means a lot to me. It means a lot to be able to kind of share this with you guys and like talk about this record because it's such a huge part of my upbringing. It's why I write the way I do. It's why I write things that maybe don't seem technically challenging to myself. And I go, oh, it's just catchy. It's this. And then I've got Austin going like, how is that again? Where's that finger going? That kind of thing. And I get it. You know, it all starts from learning shit like this, you know, and just playing this stuff constantly. Great band. I had the pictures of these guys all over my walls as a kid. You know, buying Hit Parader magazine. They had great, huge posters you could pull out of them. I used to break my jewel cases open, pop them on the wall, that sort of thing. I lived in a basement room at the time, and like it was amazing. I wish I had a basement bedroom at this point, but like the shit was just all over the walls. Like any of my buddies would come over, they're like, Jesus, man, like get a fucking girlfriend or something.
The fucking Charlie Day meme. You got
Yes,
all the yarn between them.
Yeah. God, this is a fantastic album. You know, it's maybe not as accessible as like the Killswitch record we dug into. That one's a little bit more palatable. But I think if you give it enough time, this is one of the most accessible records of the era. And it's catchy. It's just what you want to think is the hook, right? You know, we talked about that in our Thou episodes. Like sometimes it is a vocal hook. Sometimes it's the fucking riff. It's the riff. This is why we do episodes like this. This is why we do this show. It's about the riff. And the riff just happens to be the biggest hook on here. You know, it's the fucking riff. And now's the point in the episode where we talk about what we're currently listening to, what type of recommendations we might have for everybody. So I'll go ahead and start it off. I've got one track this week. I have the newest single from Gruesome called Frailty. Gruesome started out as a death tribute band and did albums in vein of maybe what certain era of the band Death that they were digging into. And what we're approaching is the human era of Death, which is one of my favorite eras. The track's called Frailty. Sounds like a B-side off of Human. I can't wait to hear the rest of the album. There's been no announcement yet, but so far the single's been released through Relapse Records.
My rec, you know, we had to fucking recommend this album, but as of recording, Thou's Umbilical dropped today. So, I mean, we did a fucking 5-part deep dive of every album. So, you know, we have to recommend the new one. Dylan reviewed it on Dill Bozer's Den. It's nasty. It's short. The songs are short. Everything sounds nastier.
I only have one thing. I got into the Hope Conspiracy like maybe last year, just through the radio stuff, because they put out this EP, Confusion, Chaos, Mystery, which was like their first bit of like new music and probably like I think like 2009. And so I think that got people excited because it's been a while since they'd heard from this band.
Early metalcore band.
Yeah, from Boston, I believe. And so yeah, then they announced that they would be coming out with a record. So yeah, at the time of recording this, dropped the same day as Thou. They released their latest record, Tools of Oppression, Ruled by Deception. First new album in 18 years. It's out now on Death Wish Inc. It's fucking heavy as shit. It's got like some great hooks. There's some there's like I think there was the single for the album Those Who Gave Us Yesterday also has some kind of like almost like a rock and roll kind of vibe to it as well, but it's awesome. I can't wait to see them. They're going to be playing the Rumble in Chicago in the like Cobra Lounge lot. I think it's like the Saturday date. They're going to be playing with I don't know if it's the same day, but other bands on that lineup will be like Weekend Nachos, Frozen Soul, Creeping Death, Modern Life is War is playing. It's going to be killer. So check that out. The Hope Conspiracy. It's a great record.
Thank you guys again for joining us on the Riff Worship Podcast. You know where to follow us at. What are those links, Austin?
Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Riff Worship Pod, everywhere. So you can do that. We also have some playlists available for you to listen to. Hits from the Crypt is on Apple Music. Riffs on Repeat is on Spotify. As we mentioned, Dill does reviews every week on Friday. More recent releases, new albums that are coming out, reviews from the Dill Bozers Den. So there's always something to check out in between episodes. But we'll be back next week with a whole brand new episode. You can give us a rating, please. God, please give us a rating. Say something nice or say something dumb. We also have an email, riffworshippod@gmail.com, so you can reach out to us directly if you'd like to maybe ask a question, maybe correct something, or just say, hey, you can always reach out to us that way. But until then, for myself, for Dylan, for Swindle, this has been Riff Worship. Bye.